Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this here in Baltimore, rather dreary Wednesday for what is going to be a very exciting discussion of restorative and transformative justice. My name is Heather Hyman, and I'm the Human Trafficking Prevention Project Manager at the Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. And I'm very excited to be here with my colleague, Jess Emerson, Director of the HTPP, as well as two amazing guest speakers, Justice and Jessica, who are going to be talking to us more about this really important topic. I'm going to leave the formal introductions to Jess, but just a few housekeeping notes before we get going. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. If anyone has any issues with that, please reach out to me directly. Contact information will be at the end of the webinar. And we do have closed captioning available if you want to enable that option. It's up in your menu. We'll be monitoring for questions throughout and comments in the chat, so please feel free to use that as an avenue to lend your voice and your ideas to the discussion. We definitely want this to be interactive. So with that, I will hand it off to Jess to get us rolling.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And thanks to everyone for joining us, and especially thanks to our guest presenters, Jessica and Justice. So I'm going to introduce both of them, just kind of give some introductory remarks to frame things, and then we'll get talking. Heather, do we want to just kind of have it just be our faces as opposed to?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So while I'm doing that, okay, so Jessica Peñaranda, she, her, is a queer immigrant mama, human rights advocate, anti-violence educator, organizer, strategist. I almost went strategist. I don't know why. Creative and healer. Oh, thank you, Justice. Jessica has worked for over 15 years providing direct services, strategic leadership, program management, community building, and co-struggling with communities and intersecting identities impacted by systemic and interpersonal violence. She currently serves as the Assistant Director of Intervention at Common Justice in New York City, where she provides restorative, justice-centered support to individuals who have been impacted by the criminal legal system. Prior to joining Common Justice, she served as Director of Movement Building at the Sex Workers Project of the Urban Justice Center, where I met her, leading public policy and advocacy efforts, community engagement and outreach, and creating programs to center and amplify the leadership of directly impacted sex workers and people with human trafficking experiences. Jessica is also a founding member of the Decrim New York Coalition, a coalition working to decriminalize, decarcerate, and destigmatize people in the sex trades. And now Justice Rivera, she, they, L, is a writer, social justice consultant, harm reductionist, and pleasure activist based in San Juan and Seattle. Justice's professional and artistic work is grounded in principles of harm reduction, anti-oppression, and healing justice, which is obviously our focus today. Her expressions, which come in many forms, seek to deconstruct carceral and punishment-driven paradigms to race, gender, and bodily autonomy. Justice has worked to provide direct services, organizing, leadership, and capacity building support to people in the sex trades, survivors of trafficking, and people who use drugs in Denver, DC, Seattle, and nationally. She's now a partner with the queer POC-led harm reduction consulting company, Reframe Health Justice. She collected an anthology, which we're going to talk about today, towards bodily autonomy through her 2019 Open Society Foundation Soros Justice Media Fellowship. When she isn't working, Justice loves to travel, cook, volunteer, and play with her cat, friends, and family. Not cook the cat, just play with the cat. Okay, good. Justice, if you want to drop your IG handle and RHJ's Instagram in the chat so people can follow you, because it's going to be a little, to read it out will be super helpful. All right, so the HTPP's interest in focusing on this topic emerged after I read during the pandemic, because what else was there to do? The 2018 study by the Urban Institute entitled Bending Towards Justice, Perception of Justice Among Human Trafficking Survivors. And this found that although the notion of justice in human trafficking cases has largely been viewed through the lens of the criminal legal system, AKA whether the trafficker went to jail or not, trafficking survivors themselves really lack faith in said criminal legal system. And so there's a big disconnect there. A couple of key points from the study to kind of help frame our discussion in terms of why we wanted to talk about these alternative forms of justice for trafficking survivors. So the first is that domestic sex trafficking survivors in particular overwhelmingly lacked faith in the US criminal legal system, stemming from prior mistreatment by the system and the people who work for and within it. They commonly reported disrespectful treatment, sexual abuse and assault, and criminalization by systems actors. They fully expected people working in and within the criminal legal system to pass judgment on them for what were termed as the survivors' mistakes or their bad decisions. They routinely described having their rights as victims of trafficking completely ignored, which in turn discouraged them from reporting violence to law enforcement, as well as assisting in ongoing investigation of traffickers. I mentioned criminalization. That played a huge role in the mistrust, with 74% of the sex trafficking survivors interviewed having had prior arrests for charges relating to their trafficking experience. And the survivors also described how having a pre-existing criminal record was used to disregard their potential victimization and also to coerce them to participate in these investigations against their traffickers. And then from there, they kind of talked about the various different types of alternative forms of justice and found that for survivors of trafficking, they were far more focused on their own personal healing and kind of moving on from the experience of having been victimized rather than the punishment of their traffickers. That was actually only a very small percentage of the individuals who were interviewed were focused on that piece. Restorative and transformative justice, actually, which obviously we'll be focusing on today, this really appealed to survivors, but has not been made readily available to them, which we'll also be discussing today. So that's kind of like the framework for where we're coming from with this. But before we get a little bit more philosophical, which I know we will, I just want to ask the two of you to offer some introductory information, because there's people listening today for whom this may be their first time learning about restorative or transformative justice. So my first question is pretty basic. What is restorative justice? Where did the concept emerge from? When? So just either of you give us a kind of a primer. I don't know, Jessica, if you want to start a primer on restorative justice, and then I'm going to ask kind of how or if transformative justice differs from that.
Sure, I can kick it off and
Thank you.
over to Justice. So welcome everybody. Thank you, Jess, for that introduction and that framing. So I'm going to just share simply what a restorative justice sort of is, and it sort of is in this bigger sort of house or framework around really looking for different processes that in which people that are mostly directly impacted by a given harm come together to acknowledge that harm and reach a decision about how the responsible person, the person that caused that harm, can make things as right as possible. And it is divorced from the carceral system, the criminal legal system. It's community-based. It has roots in Indigenous practices, but is not just practiced in Indigenous communities, right? I think before we created the criminal legal system and the mass incarceration, industrial complex, we were able to resolve our issues in community. And this is sort of a call back to really righting those wrongs. And transformative justice differs, right? Restorative justice has different processes. Like there's restorative justice circles, there's victim offender dialogues, there's a variety of different ways that is supposed to be survivor centered. In the same way that transformative justice is, yet transformative justice calls for, beyond just processes of community accountability, to actually change the conditions that create those harms. So often in the anti-trafficking space, we talk about that as root causes, right? We talk about shifting those conditions so that the harm doesn't continue, so that the systems that are created and exist that allow for harm and for survivors to not get the needs that they are not met, as you just talked about, are actually met, so that we don't get into this sort of cycle of violence and continue harm without accountability. And also who accountability is coming from, right? We're not going to rely on the carceral system or the police to be accountable to our communities. We can be accountable to ourselves, and how do we do that in this sort of space?
What did I do? Okay, sorry. 3 years in, I still can't do this right. Okay, so restorative justice if I can paraphrase what you're saying, it is a response to the individual harm, whereas transformative justice focuses on the systemic piece, the conditions that lead or led to that particular harm. Justice, do you have anything to add to that, or can you tell us, and if not, can you tell us a little bit about how and in what phases of the criminal legal system people typically find restorative and transformative justice? I mean, I'm thinking about there's diversion, there's sentencing, there's reentry, and then there's just a bypassing of the criminal legal system altogether in terms of, you know, direct referrals to restorative and transformative justice organizations.
Yeah, I can answer all of that. And so I'll say, you know, from my own positionality, right, as a survivor of violence and sexual violence and trafficking, like the criminal justice system never supported me, right? And I'm white passing, so if it's not going to help me, it's not going to help all my friends, right? And it never has. And in fact, I ended up with a charge from my trafficking situation, right? And that white man who trafficked me never got anything. In fact, he got $30,000 restitution. Right. And so the thing is that our system is racist. Our system is classist, and our system is set up to protect like cis het white masculinity. Right. And so everything outside of that is going to be punished. And that's why we can't use a violent and exploitative system to address violence and exploitation. It's never going to work. That's not how healing occurs. Right. And so when we start to look at how can we actually start to offer reparation, right? When someone has been harmed, how can reparation occur? That's what restorative justice is. And transformative justice is saying like that healing isn't going to happen in this like racist classist system. And so how do we transform all of the conditions that led to this, recognizing that we have to do it outside of that system, right? And so in a lot of ways, it's really great because there's different options for people. Like, for example, people who have children, especially with their abuser, like that's child custody, like that's going to be system involved, right? So if there's chances to do restorative justice, there's going to be a lot more opportunity for that person. Or if that person really wants to pursue some sort of like, you know, actual punishment for their you know, for their trafficker or their abuser, and they really want that, then like absolutely there's some different ways that can occur. Or if someone's like, hey, I actually am like a Black femme and I'm in police and my whole community is killed, you know, by police. I want to pursue, I just want safety. I want safety for myself. I want safety for my family. And I want to make it so we can hold this person accountable, right? Like, how can I find this person's community and hold them accountable? Like those are whole community level processes that are transformative justice. And so with restorative justice, that's going to be something that could be diversion related, right? So restorative justice is you already are involved in a court-based system, and then you are diverted to a restorative justice program. I'm really excited to hear Jessica talk more about what that looks like with adults. I've done restorative justice with youth. And so like they got caught on theft charges or, you know, like property destruction or something like that. And instead of going through the juvenile justice system and going on to the like, you know, school to prison pipeline, they were able to go into this diversion program. And it was a really dope diversion program, right? Which was a restorative justice program where we worked with them on like recognizing the harm and recognizing the conditions in their life that led to that harm. And a lot of times we work with their family too, right? And then being able to restore that through whatever means those people wanted, right? There was communication, and it meant that whatever person they, you know, robbed or property they destroyed, they had to be willing to be involved in that process, right? And so it truly was like these two people working together to restore harm. And But for transformative justice, generally, it's not even going to be system involved, right? And so there's an opportunity to try to address harm outside of the system, which is really messy and grueling work. But these are people who know that the system's not going to work for them. And in fact, the system's probably even going to harm them. And so this is, creating circles around survivors that can support them with their housing needs, their grocery needs, their safety needs, and then also having a circle around the abuser. And sometimes that means that this abuser is willing to take accountability and work with, and sometimes it just means being able to watch this person and make sure that they can't continue to commit harm, right? And so it's recognizing police aren't going to do this. In fact, they're going to make it worse. The court system's never going to help me, right? And so let me use transformative justice models to be able to create safety and transform these conditions of harm.
So, okay, I have many thoughts, but I'm going to try to be organized here. The first is, oh, go ahead, Jess.
To add, like, as Justice was sort of talking, just I wanted to like remind folks on the call that both of these models, especially the TJ Transformative Justice model, like arose to respond to this call to the underlying oppressions, right, that Justice is talking about. Women, incite women of color against violence, right? Like, it was situated by and led by, women of color and trans folks and gender nonconforming folks that were, really wanting to and it's an abolish it's a call to abolish any carceral system, right? So we can't do TJ within any system. So if you're saying you have a TJ program that is connected to a criminal legal system, it's not a transformative justice system. And the concern is that these things are starting to become sexy and co-opted into these systems, right? As a way to say that we're doing better. And the piece around mutual aid is really important because it's like this piece around relationship building. So both models, both are processes, right? Both are tools and frameworks and political sort of frameworks that really center building relationships with both the people that are harmed and the people that are responsible for the harm, right? That piece that Justice just laid out around holding that, or like watching, the abuser, the harmer, sort of make sure that they don't harm again, and having those community-based interventions where like we're gonna respond actively, and what is the survivor center, and how is it actually survivor centered, which is like critical in any of these sort of responses.
I remember, and now of course I'm forgetting, I feel like it might have been in Japan. I'm remembering a system put in place where there was, if domestic violence was alleged or interpersonal violence was alleged in the community, that community members would get together and actually beat on pots and pans to kind of draw attention to the fact that there was a harm, and also to say to the person committing it, like, we've got our eye on you. We as a community value this individual who is stating that there was harm, and we're taking, we're watching you. We're not disregarding this. I'm hearing everything that you're saying about the purposeful want to acknowledge harm outside of the system, but I'm also hearing a piece that is just trauma informed. I mean, if we're talking about trauma, right? That is when something happens to you that you don't control, and that overcomes your capacity to cope, or overwhelms your capacity to cope. And then when you've suffered that loss of control, we tell you there is only one way that you can alleviate or address this harm. And if you don't participate in it, we're going to lock you up. Do you have any thoughts about that in terms of just the trauma informed piece? Because I'm understanding how you're saying it's existing out of systems, but just providing choice in how people acknowledge harm and how abusers are handled, or how a perpetrator is handled. That to me is the essence of something that is trauma informed, to provide choice.
Yeah, so like that is a core, I'd say that's a core principle, right? Like safety, healing, self-determination in any of these processes that is centering first and foremost the person that was harmed, right? And so, in the work that I'm doing currently, we only take cases where the harmed party consents to allowing the responsible person, that's the language we use, the responsible person to come into our program, right? And that looks a different way, and then in many different ways. And we hold restorative justice circles with the harmed party, with the responsible party, with support people, where we're crafting how to right this wrong, right? And hold people in this journey of accountability. And we have the conversation with the harmed parties that in you allowing the responsible party to come in, it doesn't mean that we are going to support and assist you in creating agreements or creating accountability measures that are going to be humiliating, that are going to be coercive, that are going to add more of the harm. And so what we're doing is we're also doing political education with our harmed parties, and we're doing political education with our responsible parties, where we're letting them know that this harm existed. It's not just like, yes, an individual harm existed, and then also let's talk about all the conditions that were created that may have led you to engage in that behavior, whether it's cis heteropatriarchy, as Justice just called, which we address as well, right, actively, whether it's being isolated, not having your needs met, and really like get to that agreement, right? So it's not that we're here to be a conduit to, folks often think that survivors may want revenge, and sometimes people are. So to be truly trauma informed is to understand that people are going to have a lot of feelings until allow that to happen, right?
Right.
And then maybe this may not be the right fit. Then the responsible party may not actually succeed, because we are not in the business of adding more harm as a space to respond to violence, right? Like violence begetting more violence is not restoring the conditions and the changed behavior. Because if we talk about not just saying sorry is not actually, sorry or forgiveness are not requirements. And I think a lot of people think in these models that you have to say sorry and be sorry, but actually it's about doing sorry. What does doing sorry actually mean tangibly? And that's sort of the work that we're like really interrogating as we're moving through these processes.
I have some more questions about forgiveness, but Justice, go ahead. And then I just have a million different questions. Go ahead.
Well, I just also wanted to add that harm isn't this like static thing, right? And that's what the criminal justice system makes it out to be. Like there's a harm party and there's a responsible party, and this is right and this is wrong. But we know that harm doesn't actually look like that. Like it's really contextualized, and actually like there's multiple forms of harm that are happening in this and multiple forms of healing. And actually, so like one of the things that Reframe Health and Justice has been working on, and that Jessica actually helped us with, is that we put out some principles of healing centered harm reduction. And you can find, we're actually putting out an evolved version of that in a book I'll talk about here in a bit, but we have some older versions on our website. But the first principle is about adaptation, and I'll read it to you all because I think that it's really relevant here. So healing centered harm reduction acknowledges that harm is an inevitable part of the human experience. Responding to harm is one of the many ways we learn how to navigate the world. In a world shared by oppression, harm that has been done lives on in the bodies and communities that have borne the brunt of systemic brutalization. We can condemn harm while also celebrating the resilient beings we have become as a result. And so criminalization and the criminal justice or criminal legal system as we know it is very static in terms of how it looks at harm in a way that isn't trauma informed, right? That doesn't allow us to actually address the like not just address the harm, but create healing, right? And so that's the amazing thing about restorative and transformative justice, when both parties or multiple parties will be engaged, because that's the kicker there, right? But when that happens is that there's a way to actually be able to acknowledge harm that both parties have experienced or multiple parties have experienced and think about reparation. And it's very, very individualized and customized.
Again, Heather, did you have a question that you wanted to ask about?
Yeah, I did. So, I think many of the people on the call today, like many of us are advocates and have experience building supports and helping survivors or, harmed individuals develop those circles and those communities that will hopefully, enable them to, take the next steps they want to take in their lives. So I have a question about process for the responsible parties. Like, how do you, and I think Justice, you had just said this, how do you find the responsible parties community? How do you reach out to them to like bring them into these discussions, into these practices? I'm just curious if you could share a little bit about like what you've done in your work, and just give us an understanding of how this would work with, like, say if we were interested in doing this with a client.
I'll talk about a little bit of how that's looked, and then Jessica, I hand it over to you.
Yeah, and then we'll talk a little bit about common justice. So yeah, if you can tell us a little bit about Reframe Health and Justice, and then how people find you. Yeah.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, and then yes, I can talk about all of that. And so yeah, I mean, Reframe Health and Justice, we support organizations in deepening their practices of care and collaboration and compassion. And so we support in all sorts of things, right? That can look like instituting transformative justice practices as an organization, from all the way from theoretical to tangible, right? So what does safety planning in your organization look like? What are the internal processes that need to be adapted in order to do this work? What is the training that's necessary? We start organizing programs. One of the business partners of mine, Kate Diadamo, is kind of like the weird sex lady on the hill. She's the one who's just like taking all of the sex worker rights and reproductive justice and LGBTQ policies in DC on a federal level, and is working on those, which is really great. So we really try to look at what a continuum between harm reduction and healing justice looks like. And so harm reduction is that tactical, like, how do we support people in advancing the goals that they want to advance in their life? That might be getting housing, that might be staying safe, that might be getting an ID, right? And then all the way to how do we advance healing, not only on an individual level, but what systemic changes need to happen in order for us to start to be able to access generational healing, to start to be able to access like healing processes for everyone we know, right? And so I think when we're actually thinking about how to work with the responsible parties communities, right? A lot of times for us, we're working with survivors. And so that looks like safety planning, right? And pod mapping is like a very healing justice oriented tool, where we're looking at circles of people and support that people have, right? And so then there is an opportunity to invite in the responsible party to be able to have conversations or have a support group around them, right? And so the survivor isn't the only one who needs these whole layers of support. And if the responsible party will do that, then there's ways of looking at who their kids are, who their friends are, who their coworkers are. And there's also pressure points if they won't participate, So one of the ones that I've been working on, he sells weed, right? And so who are his clients? Like, where can we really make sure to try to like get to his community to say, here are the things that are happening? And like, maybe you don't want to buy abuser weed until this person like cooperates, right? And so it's like putting some pressure in different points, but if they are willing to cooperate, right, it's like making sure that his daughter is able to support him, and that his coworkers are able to support him, because there's a lot of stuff happening and the survivor isn't the only one who needs support. But we also want to make sure that we're not able to surround either party with just people who are enabling them, right? So what does support look like that is like, like gently firm?
What I find really refreshing about this conversation, in addition, obviously, to extending additional choices to people who have been denied choices in so many regards, is something that I think is very difficult to broach in the anti-trafficking community. And we kind of got into it, Heather, if you remember, when we did our survivor leadership panel, just right at the end, we started talking about how, the anti-trafficking movement is very much about victims and villains, right? And the dehumanization of people who do the harm, right, is unfulfilling to me. And not because I believe that there is responsibility for harm. There needs to be, and that is clearly centered in both in restorative justice models. But just that there is little to no acknowledgement of the systems and challenges in place that have built up to the harm that individual did. And I think it's very dangerous when we just kind of decide that an entire group of people is not worth care, frankly. So this is a unique, it's not unique to the anti-trafficking movement. But I think, like I said, one of the things that's most refreshing about this piece is that there is an acknowledgement of that, and that those people lacked aid and comfort and safety in a lot of ways. And that all of these things and the systems that are put in place that are not built for anyone involved in the process, that, you know, this is a way to acknowledge that there has been harm in that individual's life as well. So that's just a little note from me. Jess, can you tell us a little bit about common justice? Because my understanding from, or Jessica, I know we decided I would be Jess and you would be Jessica. Justice talked a little bit at the beginning about how restorative justice models tend to be used with youth, tend to be used with kind of lower level misdemeanor crimes, property crimes, first-time offenders. Common justice is using this with violent felonies. So can you tell us a little bit about common justice and how people get to you in this process, to kind of piggyback off of what Heather was saying?
I can, and I would love to, but I want to actually, before I get into sort of common justice, I want to talk a little bit about like the ways in which this at the core, like I keep hating to bring this back, but it's about relationships. And I think you asked the question around what can we as providers, what can we as, you know, I don't know who's on the call, if it's advocates, attorneys, you know, and one of the things that, you know, Mia Mingus, who, you know, co-developed like the pod mapping that Justice just talked about from the Bay Area TJ Collective, they sort of found, they had some like lessons learned where they found that most people have few dependable relationships. And when I think about survivors of trafficking or folks that have trafficking experiences, the sort of pattern of abuse and the way that they were sort of vulnerable, you know, a lot of folks were isolated. A lot of folks didn't have like relationships. And I think one thing that we can really think about is like, how can we support people in building that muscle of building relationships so that they can not have to just depend on who, you know, by nature, we are part of the rescue industry, whether we want to sort of like believe it or not, right? We want to be better than the antis, right? I'm sure everybody knows who the antis are, right? But we want to be better, right? But we still are gatekeepers, right? And so by the time folks come to us, they have experienced intense sort of harm or experiences where the goal of transformative justice is to actually like be preventative and like get to it sooner than the worst harm. Then we're sort of like that trust and all that, the compounding of the trauma like has left folks in a place where like they are scared, rightfully so, to like build meaningful relationships. And then the work is to actually like work to like really heal that piece. And so I think that there's like a huge disconnect around sort of like how we can actually be better in community. And I would also say that we can learn to be better in community with one another. And that's sort of another space where we can start practicing TJ and healing justice and, you know, repairing our conflict in movements before we can even learn to like do that with our own clients that we support, right? I think we can practice that actively. And so I can sort of go back to talk a little bit about common justice. So essentially, common justice operates currently the only restorative justice based violent felony program for 16 to 26-year-olds. So we still are sort of in that like prime young development phase, but are sort of folks that are moving through the adult courts as well. in order for someone to come into our program, it's referral based. So we have a relationship with the district attorney's offices in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and in the Bronx. And we're also working to support folks replicate some of the model in other places like Jackson, in Florida, in Missouri. And so, doing that work as well. And in order for someone to come into our program, there has to be a harm party involved, right? So that harm party has had to consent. Our outreach team will get the referral from the district attorney's office. They will reach out with our trauma support team to talk about, who we are. And we offer survivors of harm or harm party services, for a lifetime. So there's no end date at all, right? You are a harm party, you were referred. We'll reach out, you can receive services, including if they decline to allow a responsible party to come into our program. So that is not, you don't get services just if you say yes to letting someone in. And that's not where we start, because we are really trying to center the survivor first. So some of our responsible parties must be charged with a violent felony. So, there has to be a minimum a year or more time that they're facing in order to come into our program. And most of our common cases are attempted murder, robbery in the first or second degree, assault in the first or second, and burglary in the first and second. We have had a few gun charges as well. And the case has to be indicted, and the responsible party has to acknowledge responsibility. So we don't take cases of someone that's like, I didn't do it, right? Like we can't, how are we going to work on accountability? Mainly because
that's a different case posture.
Right, right.
I didn't do it, I wasn't there.
Yeah, and we're working out some of this stuff, but currently the case doesn't involve family, intimate partner, or sexual violence. However, we recognize that and have had cases where those dynamics are present, right? Cousins, brothers, things that we find out later. And for us, the core of assessing those cases is if we can keep both parties safe and we can meaningfully engage them throughout the program, and making sure that the harm isn't continuing, right? There isn't this pattern of continuous harm, and the program is being used as a way to sort of placate some of that harm. And the responsible party must also not be like struggling actively with serious mental illness or serious cognitive delays, because we run an anti-violence curriculum-based program. So folks like really need to be cognitively able to sort of move through that curriculum. We support people who are active drug users, and we use a harm reduction model. However, if folks have really like intense, serious like need around their drug use, that's also just because we're just not the right program to be able to hold all those, not because we couldn't, but we're just not equipped to do that currently. And what we're working with folks, they stay with us for at least 12 months to about 18 months, depending on sort of how they're moving through the curriculum. They're meeting with us 5 days a week for 1 hour, where we're doing stability days. We have gender-based groups where we're actively working on this piece around breaking patriarchy. And most of our demographics, we work with Black and brown men, as well as Black and brown women and femmes. And really trying to transform that behavior and talk about accountability, doing sorry, not just saying sorry. We're reporting to court. We are preparing folks for about 3 to 4 months before they participate in the restorative justice circle. So participating in a RJ circle is part of the program. And at that circle, we are coming together to talk about what happened. And then the next half of that circle, we're talking about how we're going to right those wrongs. What are the agreements that the person is going to work on? And it's it's consensus based, right? So we don't, agree to anything that not everyone is in agreement to. Nothing can be something that's going to add more harm to the responsible party, or anything that is going to ridicule, humiliate that responsible party as well. And they're really dynamic and really diverse and really tailored to that individual, right? Just had someone that assaulted someone because they thought their bike was getting stolen. And after that, they decided to never ride a bike for over a year that they were with us. when they did the restorative justice circle, their best friend, who was their support person, who was in the circle, suggested that he take a healing bike ride. And that was like so cathartic for him. He did it with his intervention manager. And sort of, so they're like dynamic in that way, while also being very rigorous around what things need to happen in the space to move folks to graduation. And that's kind of like what we're working on daily. Our curriculum is 74 sessions. Our themes include power, respect, internalized oppression. We talk about mass incarceration. We talk about how to work through their supports and making sure that that behavior doesn't happen again. And we have a really high, many of our participants do not get rearrested. And I think we've only had like 2 in the history of the program since Common Justice. And it works because we have stakeholders that trust us and don't intervene in telling us, this is what I think your participants need to do. Our program is rigorous enough that that the judge is not, or the ADAs aren't coming in every time we go to court telling us, well, we're not happy. We think that the agreement should be this or that. And we're like, you're not in the space every day with us. Like you have to trust us to do that. And it hasn't been easy, right? To negotiate those relationships, as well as the ways in which RJ and diversion programs begin to get co-opted to sort of have this like progressive DA sort of like following, right? And so we see a lot of that, and we push folks around that. And we just want to get as many people free as possible.
So just a couple clarifying questions, and you might have said this first question and I might have missed it. Do the district attorneys make the decision about who is eligible?
So we have the criteria that I just like said, yeah. And there's the way we work, we have an executive team. So there's like a handful of people on the district attorney's executive team that bring a case, they review it, they discuss it, and then they move it to approval, and then they reach out to us. So the DA's office are still sort of like that gatekeeper, right, around that. And we've come across some like intake issues where we end up screening certain things out, and our intake process can take 2-3 months, because we're first talking to the harmed party, then talking to the responsible party, and then making sure that people will actually be able to do the program. So that's how it works in Brooklyn. We're having some, Bronx is always a challenge up here in New York. It's a different monster, same as Queens, but in Manhattan, we're also pushing for the same. We haven't launched yet in Manhattan, but we're pushing for that same executive team to be able to make those decisions, because you have a diversity of folks versus just having like one particular person make all those decisions on who gets referred and who doesn't get referred.
Do the individuals have to be first-time offenders?
No.
Wow. Okay. So they can have intersected with the criminal legal system.
Yeah, and sometimes we have folks that have like multiple cases going on, and so the court, our judges will be able to hold one case will get resolved. Maybe that case gets resolved while our case is still, moving. But for the most part, they really trust our work, and we're able to sort of move through those. And folks have gotten, there's been some rearrests that folks have experienced, and no one has been remanded, like very few remands, very few folks going back yeah.
Now, since this is technically a diversion program, does completion of the program or participation in the program, is that an alternative to incarceration, conviction, or does it factor into sentencing?
Yeah, so it is an alternative to diversion. All of our cases end when we get lucky, and in dismissals or violations.
Okay.
So folks, after a year, they'll have a violation on their record. But for the most part, we got lucky this summer. Maybe it was a fluke, but we had 2 complete dismissals, which we were not expecting, but we love. But it doesn't always happen. But the agreement has to be that they plead to, they'll negotiate sort of what happens like before they come into the program. They have to take a plea. If they don't complete the program, then the plea sticks. If they complete the program, successfully graduate, then they will get a violation.
Okay, and then for our Maryland-based folks, violations are not crimes. They're essentially,
Sorry,
I just wanted to make sure.
Yes.
I remember being in that space, but that's not how Maryland does things. So a violation is not a crime. Excellent, thank you. That is different than what I thought. That's really unique. Do you know if this is being done, or in terms of restorative justice practices with violent felonies, being done anywhere other than New York City? I know it's not being done here.
So we just have,
well, you said Florida, right?
So we started a new I'm not on that team, but our partnerships and replication team, they're working with a team out in, I think, Jackson, Florida, and in I can't remember right now, but there's another group that is working on it from St. Louis, and Jackson, Florida. They're working to adopt some of the model, but every jurisdiction is so different and so unique, right? Like what works, and even in New York, right? Like we struggle with the Bronx. It's different than Brooklyn, right? We've had a long-standing relationship, so everything's gonna be. But I think the core piece around being survivor, right? Like allowing the harmed party to lead the process, consent to that if they need to. If they don't need to, then support, survivors, and really support responsible parties, especially like the young folks that we're supporting to change that behavior, and sort of that accountability piece is really critical. And we see that like transformation and that growth of what that means. And many of our folks are also involved in street organizations, right? And so it's sort of talking through how do you, we can't tell you to leave your street organization, right? We know that there's different implications, but how do we do harm reduction with that work, right? When you walk into the door, you might see someone from another street organization. There's no colors, there's no, affiliations when you walk into the space. Like, how do you want us to engage in that actively? How do we protect your safety? One of my current colleagues has talked through, we do this thing where we create a support, like who are the people that we can call on when you're struggling, and you're going to allow us to like bring you closer, and we can sort of hold you to that accountability. One sort of case involved someone calling their fellow street organization leader, and the leader was like, I get it, you got to finish this, don't even worry, like we got you, like you don't have to come. And so it just was like more creative ways to keep people safe and to be able to complete this, including engaging with the parts of people's lives that may be challenging, right, for folks. And for service providers, especially in the trafficking space, I've heard, just wanting it to be, like Justice said, like clean, very neat. Like it's not
life and relationships are not.
It's not. Like we've been at sentencing for traffickers with trafficking survivors who were seeing their children's father getting sentenced,
incarcerated,
and not wanting that, instead wanting just the violence and the harm to stop. And now they lost so like it's more complicated, but there's sort of other ways.
So we are going to get into that, but Justice, I was hoping to give you a few minutes to talk about your book and how some of these lessons are tucked in there. You have a new book out, Towards Bodily Autonomy, a Healing Justice Anthology, Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use. Tell us a little bit about that, and then I am going to use something awesome that I saw on your website to lead us into the next part of our discussion.
Cool. And Jess, I'm not seeing in the chat that I can actually message everybody. So maybe I'd love to be able to drop some links and stuff for folks. So sorry if I'm missing something. But yeah, I'm really excited that this book is coming out. So it's a collection of a bunch of different BIPOC authors and contributors and activists and writers. And it's called Towards Bodily Autonomy, a Healing Justice Anthology, Decolonizing Sex Work and Drug Use. And it really explores what that continuum between harm reduction and healing justice looks like. And it moves from kind of like tangible and practical to theoretical and uplifting, right? And so we're talking about harm reduction. What does safety planning look like? What are the mechanics of the sex trade and criminalization that are breeding some of the environments that we see, right? And it also talks a lot about substance use and in general bodily autonomy, and it dives into the history. And so actually the first article is a timeline of the wars on bodily autonomy, and we can go back to the 1800s and see that all of the ways in which bodily autonomy is controlled in this country, from sex work and drug use and reproductive rights and LGBTQ identity, all has to do with protecting, straight and cisgender white masculinity. That's like what it's all about, right? And so everything that has just evolved comes around to being able to protect what is essentially Trump's America. Right. And so everything is coming out of that. And from there, we can start to see what protection and transformation really look like. And again, right, we can't rely on this violent and exploitative system, right? If we really look at the system of mass incarceration in America, that is modern slavery. That's modern day slavery. Trafficking in a US context is not, right? It's actually really kind of insensitive to call it that, right? When we can see how the prisons and the system of mass incarceration is institutionally backed racism, right? And so with that, we're able to move towards what transformative models look like. And so we have these principles of healing-centered harm reduction. There's some amazing articles in there. One's called Fuck Myself into Heaven by Mona Nadi. And there's one called Sacred Stripper, that's intersections of culture and sex work and survivorship and kind of sacred sexuality. And there's one called Breaking Spells to Break, Prayers to Break Intergenerational Drug Curses. I mean, there's just a lot of really amazing things that help us think beyond the boxes that we've been put in, and to actually look at what mechanisms can be used to provide holistic support to people. And I think it's really exciting to hear about Common Justice's work, because I'm mostly in my own work as a direct service provider, and now as a capacity building provider working with organizations who are doing the work, right? We're mostly working with folks who's the responsible party will not touch it, will not take responsibility. And I think that we still need to think about how to create safety outside of systems for these folks, right? And that's really exciting to know that these reparative processes are happening. And also we're creating processes for folks when that reparation is not possible, right? And so yeah, this is actually, I'm going to drop the link because we have 130 advanced copies that are going to be available on this website between Transgender Day of Remembrance, which is on Sunday, right? We remember all of the transgender people who have lost their lives merely because of their gender identity, and International Day to End Violence Against Sex Workers, which is December 17th, which is very similar, right? People who have lost their lives because of the work they do and the way in which society devalues sex workers' lives. And so this is not the most edited version of this book. That will be coming out January 5th, 2023. And then we'll just have ongoing sales through our website then. But if you're interested, it's a very, very exciting collaboration. And I think that you'll be able to find a lot more about what we're talking about here.
Excellent, thanks. Yeah, you should be able to post all of that now. So in the description of your new book on the website, you say that punishment doesn't lead to security. And I think that's kind of a perfect segue into discussing, we discussed the availability of RJ and TJ, but I want to talk a little bit now about some of the more common concerns that come up around the use of RJ and TJ, primarily that these interventions should not be used in crimes involving coercion or significant power imbalances. So interpersonal violence, sexual assault, police violence, human trafficking, right? And that's kind of what started my interest in learning more about this, is that I read so much about how you can't do this with certain populations. And then I always think about, well, who's the person saying you can't? And if that person is not a member of said community, that makes me uncomfortable and makes me have questions, essentially. Some of the more common concerns, obviously, this is not my area of expertise, so I had to do some research before today. But some of the more common concerns that I read about were, that the victim would be pressured into taking part, so additional coercion, that the victim's safety will be put at risk through the process, that the perpetrator will, or I'm going to start using different language, that the responsible party will gain further opportunities to exert control or coercion over the harmed party, that these programs are just kind of an impetus for someone to get off with a lighter sentence, that there's a dangerous pressure to forgive placed on the individual who has been harmed, or even that the process has the potential, and again, just with these types of crimes, that the process has the potential to reinforce cycles of violence by facilitating apologies, eliciting forgiveness, which can, according to some of the things that I read, potentially laying the groundwork for further harm. Do either of you have any thoughts on any of these concerns? I mean, that's essentially what is in the literature as far as why you can't do these types of processes with interpersonal violence, with trafficking, with crimes involving coercion or power imbalances.
So I mean, like I said, we work with the people who like their responsible parties will not take responsibility, and so it's just, in general, law, right, legal code, and especially anti-trafficking law is very top down. And we see in the report that you named at the beginning, like trafficking survivors want these options, right? The one option they have to seek any sort of like, just protection is not restoration. And if they're lucky enough, right, that their like abuser ends up getting like any sort of criminal legal like offense or locked up or anything, 5 years down the line they got to freak out. And most of the time they spend 3 months behind bars, and then they get out, and not only are they afraid for their whole life, but also like the harm continues, right, with other members of the community. And in general, the reasons why they're committing that harm, right, is not being addressed at all. And a lot of times it's poverty. And like I mean, my original work comes from working with teens and 20s experiencing exploitation. I looked at, we had a lot of familial trafficking that was happening. And it was generally that like there was a mother who was doing sex work and experiencing incredible poverty. And at some point, instead of just making it through half a day on her own, she realized that, like her kid could help them get through a week, right? And like, and that was helping the kid ultimately. Like it's just really like contextualized, right? And so we're not addressing poverty or any of these things outside that system. And so I think the thing is, from my experience of working with people who are experiencing this level of harm, is that like they're like the responsible parties are not actually experiencing any sort of like consequences whatsoever. And so they just don't think that they have to do any of this. And even if this was the harm, they experience any sort of consequences, they're not going to make it through these programs. They're not showing up in that way, right? And so I just don't see it as even being an issue. And if there ends up being 1 or 2 people who make it through the system and play the system, then like at what expense are we not allowing everybody else, right, to have this? Because I think it would just be really, really hard to play this system, period. And the people who want to play the system just won't even play with it, actually, because they're the ones who aren't experiencing consequences at all.
Right. I love your point about how would we deny this for some people for whom it might work or for whom it might be satisfying or healing, because someone might gain the system. We hear a lot about that in the context of criminal record relief. Well, what if someone lies? What if someone makes up this story? Could it happen? Yes. And could someone participate in these processes as just a way to kind of get off from what they have done? Yes, but does that mean we deny that to everyone when it might be really healing for some people? Jess, did you have any feedback on some of those more common reasons for not using these processes for crimes involving coercive behavior?
Yes, to everything Justice shared, but also as you were reading, I was thinking about, I've been in this trafficking space for a long time, and I've responded to active raids in many different places, have been, supporting victim witnesses with ICE and other federal agents. And as you were reading, I was like, if the survivor gets pressured into taking part in the criminal legal system,
I know where you're going with this.
Safety is put at risk by actively participating and cooperating in the case, right? Like, the trafficker may get a lighter sentence if the survivor, and sort of what we're doing now is coercive also. Right. And can be named coercive also, right? And many of us as advocates have been doing direct service work with folks like, I remember thinking, well, we have to talk about options with folks, and we have very limited options. And it's like, you do this, and this is what you'll get. I will never do anything, with a survivor or a client, if it doesn't actually get them an outcome that they want or that they need, right? Including this idea of taking on the label of being a trafficking survivor. Mm-hmm. And so for me, it's like going back to, can we keep the harmed party, the trafficking survivor, safe? What would that look like? At what point do we intervene, and who's intervening? So instead of, the police intervening, or, community like calling and sort of being all freaked out, I think that, we need to sort of, for me, it's like pulling back and going even to the beginning of engaging communities around. We talk about human trafficking, like awareness and being aware and all these different things. I think the awareness piece for me is, what does a community intervention look like that can actually prevent, or can intervene in that moment, right? If we're gonna model TJ practices or RJ practices, like, you see a domestic worker, going down the block, and you see that maybe they're in a particular condition. You gently, slowly start building a relationship. You start, thinking about like how you safety plan, right? So there's these different ways, and also like the traffic, and I think it will depend on sort of like what the case is, and also we need to try something that's different, even if we start small, even if we take a domestic worker case where maybe I wonder what it would be like to run a circle with like, someone that maybe a domestic worker that reports to, I don't know, like the DOL or someone before, maybe not Department of Labor, maybe like a community-based like worker justice center that an abuse is happening, right? The worker justice center reaches out to the responsible parties like, hey, could we run, a conversation about how these conditions need to shift? Because this person wants to continue working, but these are the behaviors that they will no longer tolerate, and you're violating their labor rights. I think we have to try at the small scale to then start testing and seeing what we can do at the larger scale, right? Where there's still safety concerns, right? Like this person will lose their job. We know that domestic workers have experienced sexual violence at the hands of their employers. But I think we need to get creative, and we need to sort of push the bounds of that and in a safe sort of container. But I have yet to sort of see that happening in the US anti-trafficking.
Yeah.
Right? Like we're in the space where we're like, let's build survivor leaders, and like to do the work of talking about the issues and policies and practices, but where the sort of bringing folks into actually the community interventions, right? Where honestly, part of it is like the nonprofit industrial complex in the trafficking space, like relinquishing some power or a lot of power to like recognize that we may not be the best people to do it in organizations. And sort of what does that look like?
And I mean, it really is, let me actually say, I was going to say it really is not happening in the anti-trafficking space, but that's not entirely accurate. I think there is a lot of it being done informally in terms of mutual aid, in terms of bail, accessing money for bail and Black Mamas bailouts and things like that. It is being done informally, but you're right, it is not being done in the trafficking space, I think, for a number of reasons. The first is that, it's so rooted in a rescue response that we have to get the person out, right? So in your example of the domestic worker who is saying, there are abuses here, but I still want to keep my job. That is not an option in the system that we have at the present time in the criminal legal system. The person has to be removed from that. The business has to be shut down. There has to be legal consequences. And so I think it's all of those things mixed together, is that it's, the decision that the only right way to solve this problem is by criminalizing the trafficker, getting the person out. And it is really frustrating. One of the things that Heather and I chatted about in terms of potential creative ways to use restorative and transformative justice principles, we're making a lot of headway on the issue of criminalization on the state level, but we still really struggle with very few options for survivors who are criminalized on the federal level, right? And so we're talking primarily about individuals who have been trafficked themselves, right? And as a result of a variety of factors, are doing things to save their own lives, right? And to make sure that they stay safe. And that can involve harm to another party, that can involve, in terms of who's getting prosecuted on the federal level. I don't love the term, but just so our audience knows what we're talking about, bottom girls who are being charged because there are minors involved, or because they have collected money from other victims or booked hotel rooms. These are individuals who are being charged as traffickers, or being charged with Mann Act violations, which is a blatantly racist law that we are now using to criminalize primarily women of color, but that's a discussion for another day. But that seems like there's the potential for some unique use of restorative and transformative forces in that moment where there is harm done, right? And there is a victim a victim of trafficking who has perpetuated some kind of harm on another victim. But basically sentencing these individuals to convictions that they can never get off their record ever, right? And that are so stigmatizing that, guess what? They're gonna go right back into the industries that we allegedly seek to help them, leave. And I was wondering if any of you had thoughts on the use of restorative and transformative practices in situations where there are victims charged with harming other victims.
I mean, I would love to see that. I think it's going to require the criminal legal system to see more than just victims and perpetrators.
Oh yeah.
I also think that basically we're trying to point out, right, the harms of like a particular criminal legal response, and say how can we work around this, right? And so I think that there's absolutely opportunity there to say, okay, let's do restorative or transformative justice here. I think for me, that allows this practice of third-party charges to exist in a way I'm personally not comfortable with, right? Like they're horrible. And in fact, I think that the war on sex trafficking is a perpetuation of the war on drugs, except where it comes to third-party charges where we started it. And now it's happening in the war on drugs, right? Because if you sell someone a pill that they end up overdosing off of, now it's, it's even if you give it to them, right? It's a charge. And so you're
charged with murder. Yeah.
Right, these like ideological wars that are just borrowing from each other, because when one ceases to lose its purpose in terms of population, especially marginalized population control, we're just using another. And so I absolutely think that there's utility in saying, like, we really need to look at these people who are perpetuating harm and see the victimization that's happening and like zoom out. And I think that there are absolutely transformative justice practices that can happen there. But personally, I'm a little bit weary to use restorative justice because it's institutionalizing just a really screwed up practice. So that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think this goes back to the there's like the desire, right, to bring relief. And I think that's what I hear you say, Jess, right? Like, wanting to get that sort of relief. And it's like interesting you just brought that up because I worked on a federal case where this was it. And it impacted her immigration case. And to me, the challenge is also widening the net. And so like to what Justice is talking about, that essentially would be widening the net versus like actually the TJ response is to decriminalize sex work and to, work on these like laws, right? And so if it's, I think it takes like strong legal advocate. I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's like, strengthening that legal advocacy around these charges so that maybe it could be something that's like less like withdrawn. Like I couldn't imagine, for example, someone like adding that, like let's say if I was working with which I have, but like in this current program, and like we spent over a year doing a curriculum session around, the ways in which you were a criminalized survivor, like to me that would be extremely challenging and also inappropriate and not the way that we should be responding to criminalized survivors. I think there's a lot of interesting work from Survived and Punished, that has done a lot of work around supporting criminalized survivors and what that looks like, which is, as you have said, right, like the mutual aid piece, right, which I was referring more to the larger sort of anti-trafficking space, but yeah, community will always hold community. I think like we can always bet on that. So yeah, I don't know that this widening would make sense.
Sorry, again. Right. For me, I'm just, my focus is always trying to get these individuals out of the criminal legal system. But you're right, it's a lot. You still have to sit there with that open charge for however many months. But I like the idea of needing to think more creatively on how these processes can be used in situations involving trafficking. And I really do hope that there are folks listening who want to continue to have this conversation. We are over by about 15 minutes. Heather, are there any questions in the chat? Did you have any questions?
Yeah, I mean, we still have 15 minutes left. We had said till 1:30 for this one. Oh. So, but okay, which is great if we want to do that. Yeah, I'd encourage people to pop. Sorry about that. It looks like there were some restrictions on the chat earlier, but they're now off. So if anyone wants to put any questions in, please do. Yeah, my mind is spinning as well.
I know. I'm having trouble focusing my thoughts.
Yeah, well, and just again trying to apply some of these models and again, like working outside of the framework that we currently exist in, I think is very important for would be very important for a lot of these cases and the clients that we're trying to assist. And I just wish there was a point at which things could diverge. Like, again, when I think about individuals I'm working with who are both a harmed party and a responsible party, in the context of their trafficking experience, and who would like to maybe access something like a restorative justice model. And then, use that as a way to address some of the responsibility that they've been grappling with and working through, but having to do that within the carceral system it seems impossible right now. And so I look forward to further discussions about that. And again, I feel like there was such a zealous criminalization and prosecution of many people that happened, in the first decade after a lot of these laws began to get passed, and we're really seeing the impact of that now. And I did have a question. I was wondering if it sounds like many of these interventions and many of the use of restorative justice is happening like right after the incident has occurred. Are there any opportunities with either of your programs or in the work that either of you have done where it's later down the road that people have gone back and utilized these models to try and, you know, address things that happened in the past?
Yeah, Heather, that's actually a really good point, because some of the challenges around some of these programs that are in the diversion phase of things is that the harmed parties might not be ready for this, you know, right now, but down the road.
And the responsible parties may not be ready. You know what I mean? I do feel like often there's a period, like, you know, I thought it was even interesting when I forget who said there's, I think it might have been you, Jessica, that, you know, sometimes the intake process can take months, right? As you're working out whether this is going to be a good fit for the individuals that you might be working with. But I was wondering if, you know, looking even further down the road, have you seen these programs working where it's more backward looking to try and get some closure for the different parties?
So I could just quickly respond. So because the criminal legal system is what it is, many of our responsible parties committed the harm like sometimes a year, 2 years before they come into our program. So and then they're being sort of like just stuck and held in the system. So yeah, which could be, it depends, right? Like there are just some harm parties that say no, we'll just say no, right? Whether it's happened yesterday or whether it happened 5 years ago, and we have to honor that. So, you know, for the most part, cases right now, we have cases on backlog, like referrals from like years, like last, you know, pandemic, 1-2 years, you know, a couple of months. So that has happened.
I want to just add too, so there's a difference between RJ and TJ programming and RJ and TJ practices, right? And so just because Jessica and I were like, let's not create RJ programming around all of this, like you all, right, are helping survivors on like individual levels every day, and what they need looks incredibly different. And there's absolutely opportunities every day and along the way to institute like RJ or TJ practices. And in terms of RJ practices outside of RJ programming, what we're talking about is addressing the interpersonal violence that is occurring, but also helping them navigate the systemic violence, right? We're talking about the harms of criminalization and the interpersonal harms and where they meet. And so there are absolutely opportunities to institute, especially TJ practices along the way. And when someone, it's a really hard thing when someone has been hurt so much to not, and when that person doesn't experience any consequences, to not want them to, right? And so when you're saying, okay, well, can we do this down the line? Like, yeah, because to not want to hurt the person who's hurt you so bad, right, takes a while. Sometimes it's like a lifetime journey. And so like, and our job, right, as service providers is to show up and like support someone where they're at right now, right? That's harm reduction, and not leaving them there, like meeting them where they're at. And so, and that's what Reframe helps do, right? Is we help organizations set up and institute like TJ, RJ healing justice practices, right? And then that can lead to programming, but when programming is not the right step and practices are, like we can help you do that, right? And like, what are those practices? When are the right time to use them? What context do they go in? What movement or work as an organization do you need to do in order to be offering these? And like, these aren't just isolated interventions either, right? Like, what are we moving towards? And so I think it's just important to recognize that there's a variety of different things we're working with. And so if the context for someone to really be able to make a change, they need to have the willingness to do so, but also the context of their life has to be there for that. And so it's kind of hard to engage in a TJ practice or an RJ practice when like you don't have your basic needs met, right? And so we help people do all of that and like no, right? Because someone might not be ready for that, but if they have the knowledge that can be part of their like healing toolbox at some point, and they're ready for it, and the context of their life is ready for it, and maybe their relationship to like what has happened changed, right? Like my relationship to the harm I've experienced changes constantly, right? How I identify in relationship to that harm changes constantly. And so like our job is to like give people all the options and then hold space for all that change that happens.
That's a really good reframe. And it's also a reminder of how quickly my brain goes into kind of the nonprofit industrial.
Yeah. It's funny because I was gonna be like, you gotta heal this like savior, they're inherent, right? Like as helpers, right? Like how do we heal that? And I think this piece around like, I'm adamant around like first starting to practice within organizations with colleagues, with peers in the space before we even begin to, especially if you haven't been a part of like community accountability processes outside of programming and different sort of spaces like that, and resisting that like urge, because we go from I remember being a young advocate in the DV space where it was like you never recommend or never like you break that sort of like survivors that wants family therapy, or it's always has to be this like criminal legal response to now wanting to go to the extreme, right? And so like imagine what that does, right? Like it shifts people. Wait, you were telling me this, movement was telling me this, now we're here and now you want to walk it back. Like what is at the core of it, versus like what Justice is saying, right? Like you can be curious and remain in that curiosity and open up all these options. And for me, it's like giving a more language and more options as a framework, and telling people like this doesn't yet exist, but like you can do. I believe part of doing our work is also giving some of that political education as well to folks, as in their own sort of in a culturally appropriate sort of way for folks, because like they may not have that access, those resources, right? We come from a very privileged place from where we're at. And I think we need to demystify that for folks, and they may have their own, they have their own ideas and their own sort of solutions to actually what they wish things would have gone differently, and like introducing a tool like pod mapping, right? Like, hey, like, why don't we sit and just do this, like as part of safety planning, but it's interactive, it's different than like, writing something down. Like, it's like, hey, like who's the person that's closest to you, if something were to go wrong, like who's the, like you can actively practice those.
Where do you seek healing?
Yeah.
And how can we think more broadly about that? That's a really good reframe. And it seems like something that Reframe Health and Justice obviously can be very helpful with, in terms of, seeking to integrate more practice as opposed to, what do we call it? Programming, right? So that's a very helpful reframe, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's listening in whose brain immediately goes to programming as opposed to processes. So I greatly appreciate that call in. That is really all that I have. I really just want to, again, thank you both so much for, we actually have a question. Can you offer more clarity on the difference between programming versus practice in the RJTJ space?
Go ahead, Justice.
Okay, we're both like, right. So I think programming is something that like RJ is generally a program, right? Because it is diversion from a charge, right? From a sentence, from doing time to restoration, right? And so it's a whole program that encompasses that. Some of the RJ practices that have evolved and can be used outside of that systemic approach, right, are pod mapping, are different types of support that oftentimes happen after 5 p.m. right? So there are different ways. There are like specific harm reduction tools, right, that people can use if they're engaging with the person who has harmed them, or even if they're engaging with the criminal legal system. And so these are ways in which we they're tools in our toolbox to be able to say, this person wants to address healing in this way, or this is where they're at right now. What are some of the things that we can use? I mean, you probably are all using a lot of them, right? Because if you are you working with a survivor who doesn't want anything to do with the criminal legal system, or doesn't want to pursue a charge or any of that, then, you know, we're like, okay, well, obviously we're not turning you over to the police and the prosecutors to support you. So how can we help you stay safe? And that's like, there are actual tools from TJ and RJ that we can use to do that, but it's not a program necessarily to do that. There are programs, right? Like API Chaya in Seattle has a transformative justice with trafficking survivors program. And so that is something that they have a curriculum around and they can take people through, but you don't need a whole program to use the practices.
Jess, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I was just gonna, say like, share something personal. Like, I practice in my home, right? Like family group conferencing, like when there's an issue and we need to move through like a particular conflict or a particular sort of, then we gather together, like in a circle sometimes is a practice in RJ, and maybe accountability practices and a program, right? Like where I work, we have a restorative justice based like program that it uses and infuses restorative justice practices. That includes, when someone comes on, we do a welcome circle. That is a restorative justice like practice. We do a restorative justice circle. When after court, we come back and we do a community gathering, a community meeting. That is a practice that's within a program that is like funded, etc. But there are other, grassroots community-based organizations that do the same. I hope that that's helpful.
Are there any, for those of us who are new in this world and want to continue our learning? Obviously, we know about your book. Are there other resources that you would recommend for someone who wants to really start to flesh this out? Okay, transformharm.org. And I was thinking about anything, Miriam Kaba, we do this till we free us. Okay, Sher Hassan, Miriam Kaba. Excellent. And we will be putting all of these resources on our fact sheet that will be put together over the course of this quarter and then posted on the MVLS website. And we may come back to you for some additional resources. That's really helpful. Again, thank you so much to our panelists, Justice Rivera and Jessica Peñaranda. I think it's just really worth noting that people have common needs in the wake of harm, right? They need to feel safe. They need to feel understood. They need to feel validated. They need information. They need to reclaim agency. They may want apology. They may want repair. And these needs go largely unmet by punitive systems like the criminal legal system. And restorative and transformative programs and processes, now that I know the difference, really offer an alternative for those for whom, quite honestly, the system has traditionally and systemically failed, and for whom the system was not designed. So I think we're really lucky to be learning from two people who are doing this work and kind of shining a light on ways that we can be better advocates, and how we can extend the belief in the humanity of our clients to everyone involved in a situation of harm. I think that only makes us better advocates, better human beings, and a better society. So I just really want to say thank you so much to the both of you. Heather, do you have any final remarks on our?
No, just another huge thank you. We've so appreciated what was really, a thought-provoking and thoughtful discussion about things that I think we can all begin to implement, the practices, and then maybe one day the programs. But we will be circulating our presenters' contact information, which they also very kindly put in the chat, as well as some of these resources after the webinar, as well as a recording of the webinar will be posted on the HTPP website, which is just off of MVLS's main site, and we will get all of that out to you as well. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us and stayed for the discussion. We really appreciate it, and we look forward to you hopefully joining us for our next webinar, which will be January 19th. Fingers crossed with the incomparable Lauren Jenkins, who will be talking about the cost of caring. For those of you who are at the Human Trafficking Professionals Conference this October, she and I did a discussion there, and we're looking forward to reprising some of that in January. So thank you so much again, and we just really appreciate having you with us today.
Thank you very much.